So my title of my presentation is The Ethics of Radiological Risk Governance, the Justice of Justification as a Central Concern. And where do I? Green?
Yes.
This one?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. First, I'm going to introduce why I think there is a need for new governance methods for risk governance. And then I will really apply that to a number of points I want to elaborate on. I think a number of radiological risk governance issues in the nuclear energy context show a need for a more, what I would call, deliberate approach to nuclear energy governance. But I will hopefully make clear to you that the framework, the ethical framework I want to present, can also apply to complex problems of justification in the medical context. We will not discuss them, but I think today fair and effective energy governance is hindered by what I call a comfort of polarization over the nuclear issue that does not play in public discourse alone, but that is actually deeply rooted in the working of science, politics, and the market. I refer to a paper I wrote about that in 2013. Secondly, while we observe that Euratom research in the European Union is broadening by way of including social and ethical aspects and the involvement of civil society, at the same time one can observe what I would call a problematic orientation towards a positivist approach to low-dose risk research. I refer to a paper that will be published in the Journal of Radiological Protection on that. Thirdly, last but not least, as an example, in Fukushima, the issue of the so-called 100 millisievert threshold is an issue in urgent need of formal public deliberation among all concerned parties. Although there is major support for the vision that no such threshold exists, it now serves post-accident politics that are not to the benefit of the citizens. These deliberate approaches are not needed to the benefit of policy or to the industry, but in the interest of social justice. And we might think of the ethical dimensions of the radiation protection system. I want to really point you at an additional layer of complexity, namely the complexity in which this system would need to operate, the function of politics, science, and the market, so to speak. So I'm going to just hit very briefly on what I would call dealing with risk, something between dealing with knowledge and fairness. Fair and effective risk assessment, I'm going to give you 3 reflections. Then I'm going to introduce the bigger picture. The idea would be an idea of fair dealing with complexity, and I will introduce an ethical framework, an ethics of care, and give some consequences for the system of radiological protection. This is probably the $1 million question in the dreams of many, many technocrats. What is an acceptable risk? And I want to share an experience with you from 2012. In 2012, the European Commission embarked on a study to see what the future research needs would be for Europe up to 2020, so the Horizon 2020 program. Also, Euratom did that, and the result of that study is published in this report, Benefits and Limitation of Nuclear Fission for a Low-Carbon Economy. They were asking a number of experts to give their visions. I had the pleasure to be one of them, and one of the questions we had to answer was this one. What is an acceptable level of nuclear risk for the public at large? So I thought it was an interesting question in many respects. It was also a problematic question. And after some thinking, I came up with this answer. There exists no objective, scientific, economic, social, political, or philosophical rationale to determine the acceptable level of a nuclear risk for the public at large. An acceptable nuclear risk is simply a risk that an informed democratic society justifies as acceptable. So the Commission was asking a technical question. She was actually asking a technocratic question. How do we know that? What is the important word in the question? It's level. They were asking for a number, for some kind of number. So they were asking a technical question, and I gave a philosophical answer. The Commission found my answer too academic. But for me, the difference between the question and the answer is actually where the problem situates. It is between technocracy and democracy. So, do we need calculation to support informed consent? Do we need informed consent to support calculation? The bungee jumper will never ask for the test procedures of the rope before he jumps. Why not? because he trusts it will be okay, but more important, he takes the decision himself or herself. Do we need informed consent to support calculation in nuclear energy safety assessments or safety assessments in medical treatments? The answer is, of course, yes. Why informed consent could be something that can be reasonably achieved in a medical context, given the fact that the number of concerned people is smaller. It's the doctor, the patient, and the relatives, in a way. In nuclear energy, of course, it's much more complicated. It reaches out to society. So what would justice, in terms of justification, mean in that sense? 3 reflections on fair and effective risk assessment. The first one is that the assessment of what is an acceptable risk for society is not a matter of science, it's a matter of justice. Now, that may sound trivial in your ears. We know that risk is not a mathematical formula. It's a potential harm that you cannot completely know, that you cannot fully control. So what is then an acceptable risk, to come back to the question of the Commission? I think people will accept a risk they cannot completely know, they cannot fully control, simply when they trust that its justification is marked by fairness. But that can mean a lot of things, of course. I think fairness should be understood in the terms of the possibility of self-determination, ensured by what I call the right to be responsible. And the interesting thing is, if you use that quote, the idea, the right to be responsible, it can mean 2 totally opposing things. For the citizen living next to a nuclear power plant, it means the right to co-decide. It's the upper one. Risk for society. For the bungee jumper, it means the freedom to hurt yourself. A risk taken by an individual. But if, of course, we look at societal risks, for any health risk that comes with technological, industrial, or medical practices, and that has a wider impact on society, I think the right to be responsible equals the right to co-decide. And enabling this right is a principle of justice. Second observation. Societal trust in the assessment of what is an acceptable risk for society should be generated by method instead of proof. What do I mean with that? No scientific or political authority can determine alone what would be an acceptable risk for society. Of course, we need science, we need good science, engineering, we need open and transparent communication, and the promises of a responsible safety and security culture, but essentially they can never generate societal trust in themselves. The reason is, of course, that there will always be factors beyond full control. Human error, nature, time, misuse of technology, which implies that we always have to deal with incomplete and speculative knowledge in science and value pluralism, also in post-accident conditions. And I think the interesting idea about science is that confronted with the need to deal with this incomplete and speculative knowledge and value pluralism, the challenge of science today in risk governance is not the production of credible proofs, it's the construction of credible hypotheses. The deliverable of science today towards society is not longer the proof, it is the hypothesis. Look at the linear non-threshold hypothesis. It is a hypothesis that functions politically in society. So fair risk governance is risk governance of which the method of knowledge generation and decision-making is trusted as fair by society. And when this method would be trusted as fair, that governance has also the potential to be effective, because the decision-making will also be trusted as fair by those who don't like the outcome. I call that the ultimate principle of democracy. Just do some kind of short thought experiment. Imagine that some kind of decision-making is taking place in your village, in your community, or in your nation state on something, like building a highway or constructing a nuclear power plant. And imagine that you have a specific preference. Building the power plant or not building the power plant doesn't matter. And imagine that the outcome of the process is not what you want. But imagine that you say, it's not what I want, but I accept it because I know that the method that was used to make the decision was fair. This is the ultimate principle of democracy, that you can accept something you don't like because you know the decision was fair. But of course, philosophically, this opens lots of reflections. What would be a fair decision-making process? Okay. Third reflection. I think a fair dealing with the complexity of risk assessment and justification requires new governance methods. Today, the critique is that our governance methods we use to make sense of the complexity of risk assessment and justification are driven by the doctrine of scientific truth and the strategies of political positionism and economic profit. For the assessment of what is an acceptable health risk for society, one would wonder whether these methods really enable the right to co-decide as a principle of justice and are really able to generate societal trust by way of their very method. One could wonder, and we are talking about virtues towards a system of radiation protection, how in the broader societal context, virtues relevant for radiological protection, beneficence, non-maleficence, prudence, justice, dignity, honesty, truthfulness, empathy, can ever work in a world still ruled by the doctrine of scientific truth and the strategies of political positionism and economic profit. It seems as if those virtues always need to resist the methods driven by these doctrines and work against them. In other words, you can have the best intentions as a government official, as a nuclear expert, as a medical doctor who advises policy, but what is the meaning and the practical meaning of your virtues if you have to use them to work against the system? The bigger picture, the idea of a fair dealing with complexity, and I refer to a paper I published on that in the context of philosophy related to sustainable development thinking. The social problems we face today are ultimately complex. That is probably a trivial conclusion or observation. We know that. In my paper, I present some kind of characteristics of complexity that all these problems have in common. We don't have time to really discuss them in detail. It's interdependency. The problem is never isolated. They are always related to each other. For instance, climate change and poverty. Diversified impact. People are affected by the problems in diverse ways, positive or negative. Some kind of organizational complexity, because they are interdependent, we have to tackle them all together in a coherent and what they call holistic approach. Our responsibilities are relative, which means, for instance, that for me, the ability to take my responsibility can depend on the fact whether you take your responsibility as a politician or not, this kind of things. There's a knowledge problem because we have to deal with uncertainty. There's an evaluation problem because we have to deal with value pluralism. And there's, because all of that, an authority problem. The authority of nuclear experts, of politicians, is questioned, really because of all these uncertainties and the positioning that really is a consequence of that. So we have a factual complexity and a complexity of interpretation. And the simple social critique is that if we take this complexity serious, the idea is that the traditional governing modes of international politics, representative democracy, the market and science are no longer able to grasp the complexity of these social problems. And there comes this view on what could be an ethics of care to really fairly deal with this complexity. And it has implications for our daily practices also in nuclear energy policy context and in medical policy context. We have, in Western philosophy at least, different normative ethical theories. They may seek reference in universally applicable principles, deontology, consequentialism. The danger is there, the risk of overlooking the particular of specific situations. They may seek reference in evaluating particular situations, so the other way around. The danger is there, the risk of self-protective relativism. They may seek reference in virtues. Problem there is that virtues not always unambiguously translate into concrete action, and they may seek reference in the care for human relationships. The problem there is it works for close relations with known people, but it is unclear how it could work for distant relations with strangers. These are typical theoretical problems that figure in philosophy today. I think the idea of complexity enables an ethics of care that could work for our distant relationship with strangers, and that can really also translate in meaningful guidance to tackle complex problems of radiological risk governance. I think the fact of complexity brings along three new characteristics of modern coexistence. These are connectedness, vulnerability, and sense for commitment. We are connected with each other in complexity. We cannot longer escape or avoid it. Fair dealing with each other implies a fair dealing with the complexity that binds us. A simple example is that you may today decide to buy a cheap t-shirt, and you know it will have consequences for some worker in a sweatshop in Bangladesh. And so by some virtue ethical motivation, you say, I will refrain from buying the t-shirt. But you know that this will not help the problem, because somebody else could think differently being less wealthy than you are. So we are all bound in complexity in that sense. And in complexity, we became intellectually dependent on each other, while we face our own and each other's authority problem. We should care for the vulnerability of the ignorant and the confused, but also of that of mandated power. The nuclear expert is also vulnerable towards our skepticism, so to speak. Our experiences as modern human beings now extend from the local to the global. As intelligent, reflective beings, to become involved in deliberating issues of general societal concern became a new source of meaning and moral motivation for people. And this ethics of care for our modern coexistence supports the value of the principles of fairness in risk governance, to become more concrete, because I think this kind of ethics of care perspective on our modern coexistence, bound in complexity, provides a powerful reference to defend the principles of precaution, informed consent, inclusion of the potentially affected, accountability towards next generations, against those doctrines of scientific truth and the strategies of political positionism and economic profit, from the critique that are simply not efficient. This kind of ethics of care gives new meanings to the ethical values or virtues underpinning the system of radiological protection, I think. For every professional, imagine you as a scientist, engineer, medical doctor, manager or policy advisor, concerned with radiological protection, the virtues of beneficence, non-maleficence, prudence, justice, dignity, honesty, truthfulness, empathy, receive an enriched ethical meaning when they are understood as grounded in a care for human relationships, bound in complexity. It has two meanings. First, you can really see what it means for care for human relationships, like for instance, truthfulness, but also in that relationship, the idea of truthfulness becomes a topic of negotiation itself. The new characteristics of coexistence, I think, imply the need of what I would call intellectual solidarity in the way we make sense of complexity of our social organization. And I present it as some kind of ethical commitment. What do I mean with that? And it has been, Thierry talked about accountability, for instance, but you can also refer it to how we talk to each other and make really our talks meaningful. It is a joint preparedness to enable and participate in what I would call intellectual confrontation with respect to the ratios we all use to defend our interests, hopes, hypotheses, beliefs, and concerns, to relativize, and the ratios we use to relativize our uncertainties and doubts. It's a joint preparedness to acknowledge each other's authority problem and the vulnerability of next generations, and a joint preparedness to enable and support what I would call intellectual emancipation of others, with the aim to provide human beings with the possibility to develop a self-critical sense and to be a self-critical actor in society. It has a simple application context. Today, we are still educating naive nuclear engineers. They don't have any courses on the political complexity that surrounds nuclear engineering policy, for instance. They have no courses on ethics. They have no courses on philosophy that could support the understanding of what the role of science in society can be. Today, we don't live in a world inspired by intellectual solidarity, but we have the capacity to foster it and to put it in practice. There is one common virtue for all of us in that sense. I would call it reflexivity as an ethical attitude with respect to our own positions, interests, hopes, and so on. And I like this painting of Caspar David Friedrich, Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, that could really serve as a metaphor for this kind of reflexivity. Because adopting this attitude requires reflexivity as an intellectual skill, seeing the bigger picture and yourself in it, with your interests, hopes, hypotheses, beliefs, and concerns. But you could, of course, also take the South Korean Buddha as the same metaphor, seeing the bigger picture and yourself in it. But reflexivity as a skill may benefit from a solitary reflection, but it cannot be taught. The idea, the philosophical idea that is very important, I think, is that for all of us, it essentially emerges as an ethical experience in interaction with others, in informal dialogue, but also essentially informal practices of education, research, and political deliberation. So, my last point. I think this kind of ethics of care, built on the ideas of connectedness, vulnerability, and the sense for contribution can inspire new governance methods as alternatives to this politics of positionism and so on. They inspire and support new practical forms of democracy, research, and education. And the risk is, of course, always, if you present these ideas, that you're considered naive, especially by politicians then. So, an ethics of care perspective on our modern coexistence bounding complexity provides a powerful reference to defend the value and the need of things we know, inclusive democratic deliberation, transdisciplinary and inclusive research, education inspired by plurality and with a focus on developing an ethical sense and the capability of critical contextual thinking. Against these doctrines, virtues would not need to work against these systems, but can fully deploy in these systems. Because, for instance, deliberation is not seen as a political conflict where the best argument wins, or when the best politician who can sell himself in election wins, but as a collective learning process, bottom-up, connecting the local and the global. And I don't think we have to wait for a utopian total reform of society. These new forms of democracy, research, and education are possible today. They can be applied to practical cases, for instance, the siting of a waste disposal site. The only thing existing politicians need to do is to take the outcome serious. Finally, consequences for the system of radiological protection. Recalling my main message that the justice of justification, ensured by the possibility of self-determination of the potentially affected, as well in nuclear energy context as in medical context, so ensuring their right to be responsible, should be the central concern of risk governance and related systems of protection. The system of radiological protection cannot and should not be stretched to provide the full rationale for societal justification. That especially applies to the nuclear energy context. I think in its recommendations, the ICRP could include critical considerations on why and how politics and science should foster the possibility of self-determination and involvement of the potentially affected as a way to ensure fairness in justifying radiation risks, taking into account the different application contexts, of course. And last but not least, because there's a central focus on science, given the central role of science in radiological protection, the ICRP should actively promote, I think, a richer conception of science, being a transdisciplinary and inclusive science. Why? The reason is simple. That science would in principle be able to inform policy in a more reflexive and thus deliberate way, while, and that is even more important, it would at the same time be more resilient itself against strategic interpretations of its produced knowledge and hypotheses from out of politics, civil society, and the market. Thank you.